We're now moving to our second speaker on opposition, Laura Ryan. Laura is a second-year PhD student in molecular neurogenetics at Downing College, and she won the slot through open audition. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Madam President, and thanks to everyone for taking the time to watch this debate. I originally auditioned to speak on the other side of this debate, but as I was writing my speech, I had a realization. If you bear with me, I'd like to read you part of my original introduction. When I saw this motion on the term card, I knew I wanted to speak, as this topic is too important to me to miss the opportunity, but I was also nervous. My mum and sister are both committed Catholics, and although I'm an atheist, I understand how vitally important my family's faith is to them, as I'm sure it is for the billion Catholics worldwide. For this reason, I also want to make it clear that I hold no animosity whatsoever towards believers in the Christian faith or any other faith. But the institution of the Catholic Church is one of the wealthiest and most powerful political entities on our planet, and it's the Catholic Church as a colossally influential political institution that I will argue must atone for its numerous, egregious, and in many cases ongoing sins, if it is to have a hope of becoming something more than an presaged vestige of a bygone era. So what changed? Well, I started thinking about what it would really mean for the Church to atone for its sins. For me, to atone is more than just to apologize. To atone, as I understand it, implies sincere repentance and requires that you ask forgiveness, after which you gain some form of absolution for your past wrongdoings. To say, I have atoned for my sin, doesn't mean simply that you've apologized or expressed remorse, but that you've taken steps to make amends, and that through these actions, you've cleansed yourself of the impurity of the sin. So here's the thing. I realized that I just don't feel that the Church can atone for or be absolved of the crimes that it's committed during the course of human history, and hopefully I'll be able to convince you of that this evening. Don't get me wrong, admissions of complicity and sincere expressions of remorse would be a step in the right direction, but official apologies, especially of the type the Church has issued in the past, are simply not enough, and for some sins, there can be no earthly absolution. The idea of atonement and of repentance only even really makes sense within a Catholic framework. So whose definition of atonement are we considering? To my understanding, to atone, for many Catholic theologians, means to reconcile one's conscience with God, a release that was made possible when Jesus died on the cross for our salvation. There's less emphasis on making reparations to those who've been wronged, and more on personal suffering and prayer. But while individuals may find solace in this method of repentance, the institution of the Catholic Church cannot achieve absolution in the eyes of the world in this way. And what about the sins of the Church that are ongoing, that are happening all over the world today? How can you atone for sins that you are still in the process of committing? If, after listening to the speeches here tonight, you believe that the Church can truly atone for the totality of its sins, both past and present, then vote with the proposition. But if I can convince you that the Church simply cannot and will not make amends for the wrongs that it has committed and continues to commit to this day, then I ask you to vote with us. I suppose I should begin with an identification of the most serious sins of the Church as I perceive them. A few historical disgraces spring to mind: the Crusades, the Inquisition, the forced conversion of indigenous peoples, the banning and burning of books, the hoarding of vast fortunes, the persecution of the Jews, and the murders of heretics, sinners, and atheists. But there are more than enough recent and ongoing sins to fill my speech. In fact, I will have to be rather cursory in my descriptions. I was recently listening to a podcast by the BBC called The Rat Line. The series traces the journey of a high-ranking member of the Nazi Party as he flees Germany in 1946, headed for Argentina. There were two main escape routes to South America for fugitive fascists: via Spain or via Rome. Emigrating along these routes began with the early Catholic colonization, but in recent years it's become clear that after the war, they served another purpose. Once the war had ended, the routes were opportunistically exploited in an insidious project coordinated by Catholic cardinals and bishops, facilitated by a selection of clerics, and funded by Vatican-sponsored charities to smuggle Nazis and Croat war criminals, amongst others, out of Europe to their new homes in the sun. A single Catholic bishop was responsible for coordinating the escapes of the commanders of the extermination camps Treblinka and Sobibor and of Adolf Eichmann. He later said of his actions, "I thank God that he allowed me to visit and comfort many victims in their prisons and camps and to help them escape with false identity papers." He's referring to the Nazis here, not Jews. While it's unclear whether the Pope at the time was explicitly aware of what was going on within the walls of the Vatican, it is clear that this was not a case of a few bad apples, but a complex project of the senior Catholic clergy. To contextualize these actions, it's important to remember that the Church at that time not only abjugated their moral responsibility entirely by maintaining a policy of supposed neutrality for the duration of the war, even though evidence has come to light recently demonstrating that Pope Pius knew from eyewitness accounts what was going on in Germany as early as 1942, they also actively supported a number of far-right organizations and dictatorships across Europe. Mere decades later, we come to one of the most shocking and repugnant global scandals in living memory, the staggeringly widespread cover-up of sexual abuse of children by Catholic priests. I don't think it's necessary for me to explain to you the consequences of the abuse that was endemic to parts of the Church, or the outrageous lack of action that preceded the abuse coming to light. This has been well described already. But I want to emphasize an element of the Church's response, and that's that the culture of moving offenders to different parishes, even promoting them, of blocking lawsuits, and of facilitating cover-ups continued long after the apology started to be issued. It's clear that this episode in the history of the Church is far from over. It was in thinking of these events, which occurred within living memory, and considering the way that they've been handled by the modern Catholic Church, that I concluded that true, sincere atonement was not a credible proposition. What kind of apology, what kind of new initiatives or reparations could ever be sufficient for the Jewish people or to the young victims of abuse, many of whom had to fight so hard even to be recognized and believed? You may be able to think of a way that I couldn't, but hopefully before I conclude, I can at least convince you that a sin must be in the past to be atoned for, and that many sins of the Catholic Church are not. The Catholic Church is a globally significant provider of medical care to HIV and AIDS patients, but what it gives with one hand, it takes with the other. The Church's opposition to condoms is devastating for continents like Africa, where almost 20% of the population are Catholic. While in Europe and America, many Catholics don't follow this aspect of church teaching, it would be a mistake to underestimate the immense influence of church doctrine in most African countries, where sex education is in short supply and Christians are generally devout. Pope Francis, while on a plane returning from Africa, was asked whether it was time to lift the prohibition of condoms to prevent new infections. I'd like to read you an excerpt of his response. "Let us not ask ourselves if this or that band-aid can be used for a small wound. The great wound is social injustice, environmental injustice, the injustice I've mentioned of exploitation." The next year saw the Zika epidemic in South America. Again, the Pope was on his plane, flying back, this time from a trip to Mexico, when he was asked a similar question. In this case, he replied that avoiding pregnancy is not an absolute evil, and that in some cases it may be the lesser evil. While explaining this departure from the Church's position, Francis made reference to an exceptional dispensation that was issued by the Pope who reigned in the 60s. The dispensation permitted Catholic nuns working in the Congo to take birth control pills, as it was believed that they were at high risk of being raped. I suppose we can infer from this that extreme situations where contraception may be the lesser of two evils include the Zika outbreak in South America and the potential rape of Catholic nuns by inhabitants of the Congo, but not the small wound that is the African HIV epidemic. If the Church reversed their teachings on the use of non-abortifacient contraception today and humbly begged apologies for the thousands of men, women, and children whose lives had been devastated by this disease as a result of the Church's prohibition, then we could start on the very long journey towards reconciliation, but we are a long way off atonement. So I would ask you to consider, in what sense could the Catholic Church of today make meaningful reparations to women for its role in their subjugation, to Jews, to Muslims, to atheists, to the LGBTQ community, to Indigenous people, to victims of the HIV epidemic, and to any of the sufferers of historical abuses, or indeed to the many Catholics who themselves are dismayed at the actions of their Church? I'd like to close with a quote from Pope John Paul II on the subject of the Church's sins. At the Vatican's Millennium celebrations, he asked for pardon for the Church's, quote, intolerance and the use of violence in the service of the truth. And that's just it. We need to remember that we're discussing an institution, the cornerstone of which is a belief that they possess access to divine truth, that they know how we should all live our lives, and that they are ultimately beholden to a separate, higher authority than any on earth. What kind of atonement could we really expect? Atonement on the terms of the institution of the church in the form of guarded apologies and prayers? I'm just not interested in that. But atonement as it is widely conceived of, reparations, truly making things right with the groups that they've wronged and continue to wrong, I just don't believe that that's possible, not from the church of today. And it certainly can't be possible until the church stops sinning. And for that reason, I hope you will oppose the motion.